The Midlands is a heavily urbanised region. There's quite a few large cities and quite numerous small towns across the Midlands area. So urbanisation has really two key environmental problems that I can see with it. And the first is that with urbanisation comes problems with waste and problems with pollution. So they're things that need solutions. They're problems that we need to resolve through good environmental sustainable practices. The second problem is that there's limited open green spaces in a heavily urbanised region. So there are some absolutely stunning areas in the Midlands, and just off the top of my head I can think of places like Bradgate Park over towards Leicester, the Lickey Hills, Sutton Park. They're really amazing examples of green space, but they're limited, and there's not necessarily good corridors or good links between these, so we have to be very careful how we manage those, and that isn't just about how we manage them internally within those spaces, but it's about how we make sure that wildlife and trees and plants have the ability to migrate between those places, either seed migrations with the plants and animals, so that we're not just having biodiversity in an individual area, but we're having biodiversity that can move between these areas. Where you have this urban sprawl, we often cut off corridors between places, and we can see some of the urban waste and urban pollution problems in our green spaces. In this woodland, as lovely as it is, it doesn't take a walk very far in any direction to start seeing litter, start seeing fly tipping that's taking place. So across the Midlands, the biggest problem is how heavily urbanised it is. We're not going to change that, so what we have to do is manage for that urban space a lot better, and we have to prioritise things like reducing our pollution, reducing the waste that we have, and maximising how well these green spaces are managed, because there's quite a few that the management of them is not great. It's the money isn't in budgets to do that, so there's a lack of focus perhaps on how well we look after our green spaces. And I think that's a shame, because what happened 4 years ago during the COVID crisis is people really were limited with how far they could travel, so they started coming out to their green spaces, perhaps green spaces that they'd ignored. It was where they were limited in where they could get to, so they use their green spaces a lot more. That pressure that they put on the green spaces can cause problems, but we should manage to account for that, and we want to see people exploring these wonderful green spaces, these little oases of kind of peace, green tranquility that we've got in our urban area. So we need to manage them better. I think an extension of that then is that our green spaces that we have aren't just limited to parks and woodlands and heathland nature reserves. We have green spaces across these urban areas, which gardens. And if we can get those gardens to reflect the natural environment, they start to become an essential integrated part of our wildlife corridors, of other parts of the management system. If you've got a garden that attracts pollinators, if you've got a garden that attracts birds, they're not just going to stay in your garden, they're going to move out into other areas that surround you. So we're going to get this movement across these urbanised spaces through miniature wildernesses that you can have in your garden, that your garden can turn into an integrated part of the green space that we have across the Midlands region. So I think there are really two key advantages to small businesses in this sector, in this environmental management sector. The first one is their flexibility and their adaptability. WildZen isn't bound by the needs of being a national company, so I'm not guided by policy or practice in London or in Manchester or in other parts of the country. I can focus intensely on the Midlands region. So what I can do is look at the specific needs of customers and clients in this area, and I can be really flexible and adapt to their needs without having to think about what's the situation in London, what's the situation elsewhere in the country. So by being a small business, I can look at an individual client, their individual needs, and be very flexible towards them. I don't have to be strict in how I approach things, and that's the way it should be when it comes to environmental problems, because every client and the environment that they're in is going to be very specific. The second thing is local knowledge, especially when it comes to green space management. I'm in a woodland here, and I know this woodland really well. I track in this woodland regularly, I visit this woodland regularly. I also know that there's species that are present in this woodland that aren't in a woodland that's, say, 5 miles away, and the same in reverse. There's species in woodlands 5 miles away from here that you wouldn't find in here, despite the fact that both woodlands are supposed to be examples of forest of Arden woodland. So when it comes to focusing on, say, a residential landscaping client, I can focus on what the potential natural vegetation should be to their area. I know that if they're close to this woodland, the potential natural vegetation in their garden would reflect species that are in this woodland and not in one that's, say, 5 miles away. If I was over the other side of the city, I would look at what the situation was in the woodlands there, and I can be flexible enough in my approach to make sure that we're managing that environment, not just a regional environment, very specific to what that client needs in that specific place. I think if I was looking at a larger business trying to do that, they're not necessarily going to have the local knowledge, and they're probably not going to have the local connections. As the business progresses, I'll be building a network of people that are in this area that can potentially solve other people's environmental problems. So that gives me the advantage that I can localise the support networks for customers with other people in that network. I'd much rather solve a problem in Coventry with a supply from Leicester or from Nottingham than having to get supplies in from, say, Bristol or from Cumbria, because they're going to be more appropriate, and I'm also reducing transport costs, which has impacts on carbon cost and carbon footprint of any solutions that we make, because there's always going to be a cost to any solution. We've just got to offset that the solution has more of an impact on saving the environment or fixing environmental problems than the cost is going to be on damaging the environment. And one of the ways to do that is by building a really good, flexible, resilient local network of companies that and contacts that can assist each other. Essentially, the community can solve those problems. And I don't think, if you're looking at national companies, they have the local area knowledge to be able to solve problems in that fashion. Communities and individuals have a huge part to play in solving environmental problems and fixing environmental issues. You can look at a situation where you've got a small number of people doing environmental and sustainability practice perfectly, and that's still going to have a far smaller impact than a large number of people, individuals and communities, who are getting there, who are doing the best they can, who are getting it almost right. Certainly I'd rather see communities with a reasonably good record on energy, water, waste management, recycling, than a small number of people who've got a perfect record on it. It's just, you spread that impact, and you also spread the load. It means that it's not a small number of people who are having to bear the burden and bear the brunt of all of the costs and all of the investment in time to get good sustainability practice. So communities are great for doing that. They're also brilliant for spreading the message, for training, for education, for getting people invested in their local places. So this woodland here is used for dog walking. It's used for, there's a lot of people use it for sort of trail running activities. It's quite often I walk through here, and there's people, I suppose picnicking is the term for it. There's people who are sitting around, they'll come out here, they'll have a lunch break. They're invested in this environment, they are engaged in it, and what happens to this environment matters to communities, and it's a great place for getting more people in the community invested in it. And the more they're invested in it, the more they're going to push forward on things like policy and lobbying government to get good management for these spaces. So the community is vital. The other thing that communities have is they have local experts, locals who know this woodland inside out. They know their own area inside out. So if I want to know what's happening in this woodland, there are people who live very close to this woodland who I could talk to, who can find out. Even just through a walk through the woods, I'll find people who will be able to tell me that they've seen deer activity in part of the wood, or they heard a woodpecker over in this area in the wood, or they've seen damage to part of the wood that's taken place. So the level of expertise can vary, but there are local experts who will know their own environment really, really well, and that's essential to building a bigger picture of that environment. Speak to the locals, speak to the people who are using these environments every single day, and they've got a great understanding of what's going on here, which you don't necessarily get if you're not contacting the local communities and you're not engaging with them to try and understand their community needs for environmental and sustainable practice.